Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of PBRTV live sessions. Today we are continuing with our educational series with Paul Glatzel of Powerboat Training UK. A couple of weeks ago we did the rough weather rough weather boat handling part 1 video, where we looked at weather systems and how the tide and wind affected the sea conditions, to show you what you can see in front of the boat. But now we're going to actually look at the practical side of that and how you actually drive your boat through those situations. So I'm going to bring in Paul and we will start today's show. Hi Paul.
Hi Tom, how you doing?
I'm good, how are you?
Yes, I'm very good, thank you.
Good. So the people that have watched the first episode would have seen that we had a couple of glitches along the way, but we got through and we've changed our software a little bit. So today should run a little bit smoother. But what have you been up to today? I hear that you've been doing some stuff with the British Antarctic guys.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you carried in the magazine previously, British Antarctic Survey employed boating officers to go down south to King Edward Point and Rothera research base. And one of the things those guys do is, amongst doing various courses, is they come for assessment here as part of their job interview process. So been out with a few of them to put them through their paces and feedback into BAS ahead of the selection process. And then those guys will be heading down south for 18 months, a summer, a winter, and then a summer again. So pretty epic opportunity for them.
Oh, awesome. Sounds really interesting. So as I was just mentioned, we were doing this series to obviously help new boaters and those that wanted to go further afield, and also for those that wanted to brush up on a few techniques as well. We've covered off on a broad range of subjects, from safety gear to passage planning, etc. And last week we were going through the different weather systems and sea conditions from the theory side and understanding wave theory. Why was that important before we delve straight into the practical side of things?
Yeah, good question. I think it's very easy to actually just delve straight into this is what you do in terms of a head sea or a following sea. But it's helpful to step back and actually think, what are the conditions I'm going to face, and what research, what preparation can I do ahead of going out as a skipper to keep myself, my crew, my boat safer, and therefore not need to actually resort to assistance from the emergency services. So it's all about preparation and planning, whatever you do, whether it's the nicest day or it's going to be a little bit rougher.
So yeah, over the last few weeks, people would have learned what type of safety kit to have. We would have discussed a little bit about making sure that your boat is seaworthy to go to sea, to join in with and buddy up with other people as you advance on your knowledge. They would have then taken in this wave theory, so they'll be ready now and armed to be in these conditions. So what's necessary now for us to learn on the practical side? And we're going to cover off on a couple of different things, aren't we?
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to look at, sort of how we look at what is a head sea and how we deal with a head sea, following seas, beam seas, so some of the terminology and how that means we might set up the boat. And also, as you rightly point out, a couple of reminders really, do we actually need to be out there? Is it necessary to go? We need to be very careful to strike that balance as skippers between going places and seeing things and developing our own skills versus becoming a burden to the emergency services, especially at a time where they're overstretched at the moment anyway. Can we go a different route? Can we go a different day? Are the people right? Is the craft right? And does someone know we're actually out there? Things like we talked about previously, our way safe tracks. So what we're going to do is crack on and, if you're okay with it, have a look at or discuss head sea, following sea and beam sea.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what you just said there about, questioning ourselves if we need to be in those conditions in the first place. I remember a while ago being in America and talking about how the RIB market hadn't been traditionally a lot slower to take off in the US. And I was explaining that, when it gets rough, you've got a boat that's very capable, the 4x4 of the sea, you can get to destinations. And pretty much every person I met was like, why would you want to be doing that? We'd just be in the bar,
That's a fair point.
Yeah, but we want to be able to encourage people to be able to go off and do different adventures, don't we? But do it safely. but when the weather does blow up, that you are prepared and that you do it in a way that gets you home safe, don't you? So yeah, let's start. So shall I start with showing the first slide, and we can get cracking?
Yeah. So we've got a few images that come up, and we're going to hopefully time these in at the moments to actually speak about them. So we're going to start off talking about head sea. And what's a head sea? Well, a head sea, or up sea, as the RNLI will refer to it, or other organisations sometimes refer to it, really it's when the wind is coming to you really directly onto the bow or a little bit either side of it, as per this image. So we're going to be pushing into the wind, and that has various effects on us. So if the wind is coming towards us, then water is coming towards us, and that influences the shape of the waves. And I think if you think back to some of the stuff we covered last week, we talked about the movement of water and the way that the wave will actually sort of heap up. And that creates a far more vertical face of the wave as we move towards it. And that can have an impact, which is impacts insofar as that water could move towards us at 20, 22 knots, and we're moving the other way at whatever speed we're moving. And obviously that wave to boat impact has an impact on the vessel and quite obviously the crew. And I think it's a truism to say that more often than not, it's the people that suffer and fail before the boat does. And quite clearly as a crew, we don't want to suffer. So there's various different things we can go through now in terms of how we set up for a head sea.
So when we're coming into a head sea, there are obviously different things and practical things that you can do to be driving the boat, and that's very different, obviously, to a beam sea and a following sea, which we'll go through. But things like trim, etc., are going to be vitally important in this situation, aren't they?
Absolutely. So if we think of the front of the boat, the pointy bit at the front, then with a head sea, we're going to want to trim the bow down, and we want to use that V shape. That cutting tool to cut through the waves. And that's where there's a material difference that we experience in a flatter V hull versus a sharper V. In a classic case, you were looking at Gemini ribs the other week, or Scorpion ribs, very sharp, like the Axopars, very sharp Vs at the front, have the ability to slice through, and actually pushing that bow down keeps the nose down, and it helps it in terms of the wind coming towards it, but helps to slice through that wave as well. So the general position in terms of trim is to trim the bow down into a head sea.
And do things like wavelength, a longer wave distance, etc., do these things all sort of have a big factor with a head sea?
Absolutely, and it's very much about time, really. If we think of wavelength, and we've got two crests as a wave here, if we've got a very small gap here and the boat is, say, that long, then potentially the boat comes off one wave and it's into the crest of the next, and you've got very little time to set the boat up. And a classic example of that is the Solent, where you tend to get very short wavelengths, and it's very difficult actually to drive them, versus if the wavelength's longer, you've got far longer as the skipper to set the boat up, to read what's coming, to manage the steering and the throttle, to be able to attack, to position yourself into that next wave. The less time you have, the less you can set up, and it's just going to be repetitious impacts on you, which is very wearing on you and the boat. Yeah,
I also find that some people can be quite wary of a head sea, but I find, and we'll go on to a following sea, but I find that a following sea can sometimes be in a far more dangerous situation than a head sea. At least in a head sea, you can see what's coming up towards you, and you can trim the boat accordingly. And you tend to be able to, other than the odd larger set, you tend to be able to get into quite a good rhythm, don't you? Once you've fine-tuned your skill set.
Absolutely, and I think in part it's the winds in your face, the sprays in your face. You can feel it against you, and as we'll come on to in a following sea, when that wind is behind you, you get lured into a false sense of security. I would say, I'm just making this statistic up, but I would say 9 out of 10 of my most scary moments have been in following seas, not in head seas, because you see what's coming towards you and you manage it. Whereas there's a danger you get caught out with following seas, you get complacent and you're lured into a false sense of security. So head seas, yes, can be very dangerous in the wrong, if the conditions are not right, but it does tend to slow you down, those impacts and that wetness and wind into your face.
I'm going to show a slide which is going to be within this subject, because we've talked about trim, balancing the boat accordingly, but a major factor of that is obviously going to be throttling the boat correctly.
Absolutely.
So if I show this little animation here, and I'll try and make it a little bit bigger. Let's go that way. Can you talk us through what we're seeing here? And I can replay it a couple of times so people can see it.
Yeah, that's going to be good. And we'll just keep playing it, actually, because it's sort of almost on a loop. And we can see the boat sort of on the flat in that image and powering up towards the crest of the wave. And then you can see that little image at the left, the throttle back to not push over the top of the wave. What we don't want to be doing at the top of the wave is just taking off, clearing the props out of the water, because the props are then not doing anything, and there's going to be a very big impact potentially at that stage. So it's powering up the wave, easing up at the top, letting the bow drop, pushing down the wave, and it's just a continuous process of doing that. Now that presupposes that the wave pattern allows you to do that, and sometimes the waves, the wavelength, as we said, potentially is too short, and you just don't have the time. That's a sort of, I suppose, an idealistic set, but you do get that. And if you can drive that sort of power on, power off, power on, power off. So very much one hand steering, one hand throttle. You need to be ready to deal with anything. And it's that sort of constant balancing of the power of the boat relative to the wave, pushing through that crest of the wave, but not taking off. And we'll come back later on to why that could cause us a real problem.
I'd say also from a practical point of view, that especially on ribs and smaller boats, having your hand at the base of a throttle rather than at the top for a beginner is going to give you a lot more control rather than an aggressive movement back and forth. You want to be I think that's
a great point, Tom. And I think at the top you've got a lot more leverage. And I would say when we're starting off training someone, I'd always have someone on the training as in Powerboat level 2, someone hand at the top, because it's nice and simple. But then as you're going faster, as you're in rougher conditions, getting your hand at the base of the throttle and bracing it against the throttle unit in some way allows you very fine movements, literally millimetre, 2 millimetres. And that can make a big difference. Where you might be compromised might be the engine. So we used to have a rib which had a really big Yanmar diesel and a turbo. And the problem was you had to wind everything up to about 2,000 revs to actually get that power to come in. So you would sort of constantly be managing it on the edge of the turbo, and that was quite challenging. Whereas outboards, that power will tend to be instantaneous, and you'll get very, very good movement from just a millimetre or 2 of movement of that throttle.
Superb. So I've got another slide here which I'm going to bring up, which is talking about the tactics of zigzagging. Can you explain a little bit about that while I load up the next slide?
Yeah, and this is where it actually comes back to that discussion we had at the last session in terms of reading what you're facing. And if you're faced, and we've got another image later on, if we're faced with sort of a wave coming in here on this side and we've got a nice big gap here, well, why don't we come round to the right and push through that space and try and find a route through the waves that actually makes travel easier. Now, we need to be careful, because if we're constantly doing that, depending on what we're sitting on, shock mitigation seating, or if we're bracing ourselves with our legs and we're sitting on a seat, there's a danger that the force comes onto us in an inconsistent way. So we've got to be careful as a driver. But if we can sort of just find a route that creates a flatter, safer path, then that improves the experience for the people on board the crew, and it makes it safer. And there will be organisations that need to get from A to B, and their people, when they get to B, need to do a job. Military, sort of commercial operators, and there's no point trashing those people between A and B, and then they get to B and they just can't do anything because they can't walk at that stage. So if we can find a smooth route, let's try and take it.
And I think that will come also with experience as well, won't it, and seat time with all these things, where people become more familiar with being able to read these conditions.
Absolutely.
There is such a thing called a pendulum effect. For the uninitiated, can you sort of brief us on how that affects a head sea?
Yeah, the pendulum effect is sort of quite, actually, I've got a boat or I use my phone, actually, it's probably easier. So imagine we're coming along in our boat and we hit a wave. So we hit this wave and we're going too fast, and we hit it and we power up, and the back end of the boat clears the water. Well, if you think there's engines on the back, whether outboards or inboards, they're heavy. And we can see that in this image here. And imagine then the top of that boat is just held. If you just hold it there, what's going to happen? If the back end's free of the water, it's naturally going to do that. That's exacerbated if the wind is here and holding the bow in position. So there's a real danger that it's going to come over and then turn over. And I've certainly been in that position many years ago on Atlantic 75, where it hit, came out, the props were spinning away and you could just feel it going over. But thankfully, the back end just hit and it came down. It was hard, but we were grateful to actually be the right way up. So the pendulum effect is one of those things that can really catch you out, and hopefully you get away with it. But the best thing is not to get there in the first place. And that's about not powering into the wave with too much speed, which causes that impact and then that takeoff, because we want to keep the props in contact with the water so they can do their job.
How would you keep a boat balanced in that situation then? You know, you and I know how to do that at speed and drive into a head sea while keeping good forward momentum. But for the uninitiated, we don't want people fearful that the moment they go into a head sea, they're in danger of flipping their boat over backwards, do we?
No, and I think it is really difficult, isn't it? Because to a certain extent, the only way to do it is to go out and play and practice. And I think go and play and practice in far smaller, in small waves. So it doesn't need to be big seas. You just have some waves and just practice coming off and on and off and on, and just practice that and feel how the bow actually drops. And then there will be some slightly bigger waves and you do it again. And it's just about not pushing it too far. If you're absolutely blasting along and you hit, I mean, just think about it in a flat sea, you can be blasting along and suddenly hit the wake of another boat and then suddenly really take off. And it's just simply trying to avoid that. It's actually limit your speed, and you know, things hopefully will end well. And we've got a video here. The two videos that we've got during today are both available on YouTube, and you can search Whitstable lifeboat. This was a number of years ago, and this is an Atlantic 21 launching on service. The background to this is that my understanding where there were multiple maydays ongoing in this area, and the only resource available, all helicopters and other boats were already tasked. So the Atlantic chose to launch. It's launching into some pretty choppy conditions. Those conditions ease once it's past the shallower bit around this launch site. So you can see the boat going out, and you can see obviously there's some quite serious wind and waves there. And there's no suggestion in any of this that, you know, there's no criticism implied in the helm here, because, you know, it's all very easy to sit in an armchair and critique what other people do when they're, you know, driving a boat, whether they're voluntary or paid for it. But you can see here the boat's gone sort of pretty much up and vertical, but it's carrying on. And at the moment we'll zoom back and then it will zoom in this video, and you'll just see the boat hitting the wave, holding up, the bow being held by the wind, and it coming over. Now, thankfully in that situation everybody was okay, and I'm not, you know, critical of that helm at all. It's very easy sitting here, but it just shows you that if that balance is wrong, then that can really affect things. The Atlantics now carry bow ballast in terms of water by default, so that can actually bring the bow down by putting more weight into the bow.
Yeah, it's an interesting video, that one, and yeah, it's been circulating on YouTube for a little while.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I'm going to show a slide that then distinguishes a head sea from a following sea. So can you talk us through, the people that may not know what a following sea is, and I'll put the slide up.
Yeah, so following sea, if head sea is wind in our face, following sea is wind from behind us. So following sea, or down sea, as can be referred to by some organisations. So if we consider it really either directly behind us or in that zone, you know, probably between about 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock behind us, there's no strict definition of that. It's sort of just a rough sort of approximation. And as you said earlier, Tom, and I 100% agree with, I think this is, you know, potentially a really dangerous situation because you don't feel the conditions, and because the wind's behind you, because you've got less spray in your face, you get complacent and you start to go faster, and you try and find a route, and then you really get caught out. And one of the phrases around all of this is stuffing, and the danger is that you come off the wave and then into a hole the other side, and the bow drops and just goes into the back of the wave in front. And we'll cover in a moment how to drive it better than that, but stuffing can be a little bit of an occupational hazard. I've done it off St Catherine's. I remember doing it in a 7-metre rib craft going through the Solent, and thankfully I was wearing a gecko helmet, and I just stuffed it into really, quite a small wave, and the whole boat fills with water. But the problem is you move forward and potentially impact the console, and this happened on Round Island, going into Dingle, one of the boats stuffed, and literally destroyed. The steering wheel was pushed in on its spokes, and the guy who was driving, his chest impacted and did it off the Orkneys as well. We were going into the Orkneys, 2 scorpion ribs, and the following sea, and the other one, 9-ish metre, just stuffed it, destroyed all the screen, filled the boat up, and the guys were very lucky to get away with it. So potentially a very dangerous situation. You've just got to be careful and drive it properly.
And also, I would say also on stuffing, especially in a following sea, that certain designs of boats don't lend themselves well to inherent buoyancy in the bow, do they? So a big delta rib with a big shear, or a big rib craft or something like that's going to, or the photos of the Gemini that we shared last week, they're going to have inherently a lot more bow lift in them than maybe a long, narrow performance stepped hull. I remember I was driving a Pasco, which is a fantastic, well-handling, beautiful rib, as everybody knows, very performance orientated. And it was a really rough day across Poole Bay, big seas, boat was performing brilliantly. I then came into the channel about half a mile from the chain ferry, and slowed down, was just in the big rolling sea coming through. Wasn't really paying attention, and that was the point that I filled the boat up, and it just touched the nose of the next wave in front, and yet just scooped the whole. And I stayed dry for the last 2 hours, and at that point I was completely drenched from head to toe.
And I did exactly the same going into the Lymington River. A passage in a 48-9 to Lymington a few years ago, got to the bottom of the Lymington River and stuffed it straight into a wave. And I think part of it is it's because you're getting close to home and you take your eye off the ball. And I'd always sort of urge skippers, when you're getting close to home, that's when things go wrong. You relax in that last 10, 15, 30 minutes. And it's true in a car or a motorbike or in a boat. You've got to be super, super careful at that stage. And if anyone wants to see, you refer to deltas, and the image behind me is a big 12-metre delta. But some great examples, if people go online and look at Safe Haven Marine and the boats that they create, there's some truly awesome videos on YouTube. But what you see there is when the boat comes and the bow goes down, there's so much inherent buoyancy in that bow, you never see the bow dropping below the water. The buoyancy brings it back up, ready to fight another day and go straight onto that next wave. And that makes a massive difference for the skipper.
So another aspect, like how we covered off going into a head sea, we need to obviously trim the boat accordingly, which we'll talk on in a second. But I'm going to show the animation of throttling the boat, because there's difference in tact here, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. So the image we'll see here is we can see the shape of the wave. We're on the back of the wave, and we'll just keep playing this a couple of times and talk through it. So firstly, we're going to want to trim the bow up slightly, and that's simply so when we come over the wave that we're not nose down into the wave the other side. And you can see us moving up and climbing up the back of that wave and potentially sitting up at the back of it, and that gives us height, that gives us visibility into the distance. And you can see there's a very sheer drop the other side of that wave. So what we don't want to do is to just power over it, because then the bow's going to drop, potentially stuffing it, and then the boat can come to a catastrophic stop, but you carry on. So by sitting on the back of the wave, what we're waiting is for that wave to break and dissipate and drop down. And then once that's done, push forward, sit on the back of the next one. And you can just keep that going. And if you've got those sort of waves that are breaking, then you can actually get into a really good pattern of that. But what you need to be really careful of is what's going on behind you, because you could have the next wave catching you up, and that can cause you quite a few problems at that stage in terms of the danger of broaching.
I think there's also there's some good videos where you can, it's all over YouTube. If people Google Haul Over Inlet in Florida, where you've got a tidal situation as well. I've been there a few times in big center consoles doing tests around the Miami Boat Show time, and yeah, it's quite an interesting waterway. But you can drop down off a wave, and you can enjoy sort of surfing and all be fun. But then you can sort of catch up, and the nose can still dig, can't it? So you've got to really make sure that you've got your wits about you.
Yeah, there's a danger you sit too far back. So if the wave's here, then you need to push forward onto it, because if the one behind you catches it, and I think we've got an image coming up on that actually, then there's a danger that the wave coming from behind you lifts the back end of the boat, starts to make you surf, at which stage the bow digs in. The risk then is you rotate, and there's a general rule of thumb, you know, it's not necessarily a perfect science, but if the height of the breaking wave is equal to the beam of the boat, then there's a very high probability you're going to get rolled at that stage. And that's quite clearly not ideal.
So I'm going to bring up this slide of broaching, and yeah, we can talk a little bit more about that. Let me just bring it up. So I'll try
yes, you've got
for everybody.
If you're going with the wind literally right up behind you, then you've got to sort of be mindful of what's going on behind you. Sometimes, obviously, or quite a lot of the time, potentially the passage you seek to make might be at a slight angle to the wind, and that's, you know, exacerbates the problem where the wind sort of picks up the stern and does that. And then when you surf down, the danger is you literally, the bow digs in and everything rotates around a pivot point in the middle of the boat, and then you beam on to a breaking wave, and that's when things start to go very pear-shaped. And again, search on YouTube, there's plenty of that sort of stuff around. And it's not a good place to be. So
we've talked about the throttling the boat correctly. We're going to talk a little bit about finding the correct path through in a second, the danger of broaching, and potential stuffing of the boat. Along with the stuffing, we need to obviously manage our trim accordingly and adjust that to which type of sea that we're in. So can you talk a little bit about our trim position for a following sea?
Yeah, so in a following sea, we're going to want to, so if the wind's coming from this side here, then trim up slightly, and therefore, as we're coming off the wave and onto the next one, the bow's naturally a little bit up, and then when it's then presenting onto the back of that wave or into the wave that you've just gone over, then it's just naturally pulling the bow up and reducing the probability of stuffing. And I think, going back to the reference I made to the Orkneys earlier, I think then the boat was trimmed down too much, and it just came off the wave and it just naturally went in, and then, as we said, the danger is it sticks and rotates. That said, you've always got to, as a skipper, whether it's up sea or down sea, is actually play around with your trim and see what works, because every boat's slightly different. And it may well be that you actually make quite good progress depending on the particular size of the waves, with, you know, a different trim setting one day than you do the next. So I think you've got to be mindful of what the general rules of thumb are, but then adapt them according to your environment.
I'd say also just make those adjustments gradually. Don't just trim it all the way up and then you just have a situation where you're flying the boat up or whatever it may be. You want to be able to see the gradual effect that it's having on your particular boat and in the sea state that you're in, aren't you?
That's a good point, actually, because one of the things is you can change too many things at the same time, and then which was it that actually made the difference? So, and that's part of practicing, isn't it? Which is just driving and sort of just playing with the trim, keeping the power constant, doing what you need to from a steering point of view, but then just playing with the trim and seeing how that impacts the way that you're impacting waves and the progress you're making and the speed you're actually getting. And that can make a big difference. Sometimes less speed, you know, the hare and the tortoise type thing, less speed achieves you more progress. And that seems counterintuitive, but actually backing off a bit and making the whole ride far easier allows you to progress more quickly.
So I'm going to show a slide here of finding the right path through in a following sea. So can you talk us through what we can see here?
Yeah, so another image where you can see sort of various waves breaking, and we're sitting on the back of a wave and we're letting that dissipate, and then that breaks and we move forward. But it may well be that we're able to choose a path through. Again, it will depend on the particular conditions, and you've got to be super careful. Does that nice flat area of water in front of you, is that a nice flat area of water, or a couple of feet beyond that, is there a damn big hole that you're going to power into? You're going to power over the back of what you thought was a flat piece of water, and suddenly there's a big hole. So you've got to be super careful in that situation. But you might find that you can make some quite good progress. And that's going to very much depend on, again, like you said, Tom, the buoyancy in the bow, because some boats will let you get away with maybe getting it slightly wrong, and others will seriously bite back if you get it slightly wrong in terms of going into a hole. So you've got to factor in all of these different factors that influence how competently you can actually and safely you can drive through this sea.
Would you say also that keeping an eye on weather conditions, like we were talking last week, you can really help plan your passage planning, so that if you go, say, for example, the wind blowing from the east, you can go, okay, well, I'm going this direction, the wind's going to be behind me, it's going to be a smoother passage inherently for my family, etc. So do you find that as that knowledge builds, that's going to help people be able to have a better understanding of the journey that they're about to take on?
Yeah, and I think it's an absolutely sound point, and I think it directly relates as well to how much you've hurt yourself or your boat or other people in the past as well. And you mentioned family, and I think as we all get older, we get more sensible sometimes. What we were probably doing boating-wise in our 20s and the impacts we were prepared to take are different. And I think we're all mindful nowadays of the fact we go out and we get battered, well, our back and our knees are going to pay the price in a few years' time. And actually, that's good skippering, isn't it? Having a look at an area and saying, well, actually, we've got an area of shallows around that headland, we got wind against tide, or we go 2 miles south of that, and actually in all probability it's going to be a lot flatter because we don't have that dramatic change in depth around the headland and that dramatic flow of water around the headlands. And that's good planning. And if that makes for an easier life, you might do 5 miles more, but if you can do that at materially greater speed, then you get there far quicker and in a better state.
So we've discussed head sea and following sea. What's the difference between these two and a beam sea?
So beam sea, the beam of the boat, the side of the boat, is really then again between about that 10 o'clock and that 8 o'clock position if it's on your port side. So it's when the wind's coming down on your left or your right, your port or your starboard side. And interestingly, a beam sea you can actually potentially make some pretty good progress in. And I remember an example when we did around Britain quite some years ago, and we were going from, I think it was Falmouth to Baltimore in Southern Ireland, and long passage across the Irish Sea. And it was due to be about 4 to 5, and it ended up about a 7 to 8 head sea. And we were just punching into this northwesterly, and it was pretty horrible. And we were about halfway across, and the GPS was saying 6 hours to go, and we were doing about 6 to 8 knots. And an hour later, it said 6 hours to go, and an hour later, it said 6 hours to go. So we thought that wasn't practical, and we turned around, changed the heading to head up towards Cork, and we went from about 6 knots to 20 because we were able to get a flatter area of water to move through. Then we started to make more progress. And there's an image actually we could bring up that will actually sort of give that example of actually finding a good route through a beam sea.
Yeah, so often the your point A to point B, just straight lining it, is not necessarily the fastest way through something, is it? Absolutely.
And as we've said, really, it's about whatever direction you're going, whether it's up sea, down sea, beam sea, you potentially, and we've had a similar image with each of these, we can potentially find a smoother route. And what we need to be careful to do is to be very wary in a beam sea of what's coming from upwinds. So our upwind side, whichever side that actually is, that's where there's potentially a lot of risk because we're potentially beam onto a breaking wave. So we're moving forward and we might see a breaking wave ahead of us. Well, actually, let's just back off a bit. Let's let that wave go through and then go around the back of it. Or it might well be that we actually see it coming and we power forward into an area of smoother water. Or it might well be that we can't get away and we need to turn and come up and go into that wave. And what that means is we need to have reserves of power. Because if we're driving at full speed and we're literally got no more power, we can't get out of that situation. So I can't give you a percentage, but you need to have enough power to be able to move forward, to drop back, to move up and fight that, see if you're going up. And it's always something as a skipper, never operate at the limits of what you're actually doing.
You talked earlier about going up to Cork and changing tact, and obviously this graph here. to the new boater, we're not suggesting if you need to go north just to completely go east or west. You can go a little bit of a tact, can't you? And you can find your way through, but it just takes that edge off, doesn't it?
There's a really good example, actually. The other day I was out on a boat and it was quite windy in the harbour. And as the instructor, you stand on one side of the boat, and sod's law says that's generally the wet side. So we're driving up and I need to head off at 90 degrees to my right, but I know that's going to get me soaked as an instructor. So what we did was we just headed upwind, and the waves are only tiny, but they were enough to get us wet. So you head up more upwind than you need to, upwind rather, and then turn and come sort of turn it almost into a following sea at an angle, so the wind is then behind you. They're only tiny little waves, but actually I kept dry. So even something as basic as that, just keeping your family dry, you can do by actually thinking about how you present the boat relative to the wind and the waves.
I've also had where you've had like a really horrible sea across Lyme Bay or something like that, and just by coming in, attacking towards Chesil Beach and then hugging Chesil Beach really close, so you're a bit protected from the prevailing winds, I've been able to run up and shave sort of 45 minutes off my journey, and I've been in almost flat calm conditions just because I've got out of the weather and just changed the destination rather than going from, say, Portland to Brixham and just straight lining it across. By hugging and going up Chesil Beach and past Sidmouth and Exmouth and across, you can have a lot of a smoother ride for your family.
And that's about using a headland, and that comes back to your point, Tom, about using a chart. So you can look at a chart and you can say, well, look, the wind's from the southwest, it's going to be protected, this area of water, by this headland. So actually, rather than going 2-3 miles off, if we tuck in close to the shore, then we can actually get protection from that headland. And okay, when we pop out, we're going to be exposed. But if that means we do 20 miles of a passage with protection, and then we get around into the next headland, then that's good skippering, that's good planning.
I'm going to show another slide here, which would relate to a head sea in a surf condition, but also a beam sea, like you said, keeping an eye on things that are happening to your beam. But can you talk us through a little bit about this condition, because this is going to feature on both a beam sea and a head sea, isn't it?
Yeah, and this comes back really to our reading of waves. If we look back to the previous session and we looked at where the energy was in a wave, and we've got sort of 4 boat positions from the left to the top right there. And we've got this wave that we can see that's breaking the plunger in the middle where the high energy element is. And then to the right of the wave, we can see it dissipating, and to the left, we can see it building into that high energy. And then we've got those 4 boat positions. And the question then is for you as a skipper is, where am I going to take my boat? To the far right, potentially, everything's dissipated, the energy's gone, and we could push through. Might be a bit wet, but actually the energy's not going to hit us head on. The middle part, where we're going to go straight at that plunger, we put the bow into that, and that energy is going to come down on the boat. So it's either going to come on the boat or push back against the boat, and equally, potentially, it's going to push us bow more up, with the risk maybe if we've hit it too hard and fast of actually going into that pendulum situation. On the left-hand side, it looks pretty calm, but actually, how quickly is it building to become that plunger, that high energy wave? And I can't give you, none of us can give you solutions to all of these things, but if you now start to look at a wave and think, what am I looking at? Where am I going to drive it? With these considerations in terms of beam sea, following sea, head sea, then you can actually start to think, well, actually, by applying that knowledge I've got, I can actually start to make my life a lot easier.
What would you say you would do in a situation where you're going to get the prop out of the water? The things that people need to be prepared for as a new boater if they start to hear the prop spinning and barks from the engine?
Yeah, we've all done it, haven't we? And it does sound, when props come out of the water, it does generally sound quite impressive. But the props are designed to be in the water. They're designed to rotate and to move you through water. So if they're not there, then they're starting to overspin. And people say it might damage it. For the short amount of time that's happening, it's unlikely to damage. But when they then come back in, if you're going along at speed, then they take a while to sort of regrip. They might spin, Or in this situation, the image we've got, and this came from RIA training years ago, was potentially if the boat comes out of the water and then drops back fairly vertically, the temptation is to take the power off. And the problem that might cause is you take the power off, and then basically there's an opportunity for the water to push up through the exhaust, and the engine's exhausting through the center of the prop. So by reducing the pressure from the exhaust, you're allowing water potentially to actually come up into and maybe kill that engine. So from an RLI training point of view, they'll tend to say, actually just blip the throttle a bit, just to increase the power, increase the back pressure, and reduce the probability of that happening. That's sometimes easier said than done. And that's possibly more the domain of someone that's done this quite a lot and they're really getting used to it. And it's fair to say, obviously, the RNI or other life-based services are operating in some quite extreme conditions sometimes. But it's just a thought to have at the back of your mind, and it's very counterintuitive. I remember when I first learned that, thinking, yeah, that sort of makes sense, but I'd never really thought about it. And it's just something to have at the back of your mind.
You want to keep that forward momentum going, don't you, really?
Absolutely, yeah.
By having, like we said earlier, by having your hand lower down on the throttle, etc., not doing aggressive, massive changes, you keep the boat a little bit more balanced, don't you? Because if you're on and off and you're making big movements, you also change the center, where the center of gravity is in the boat, don't you? You want to keep things pretty balanced.
Yeah, you might find it will vary in different situations. Sometimes you might end up with sort of like quite a lot of throttle movement, particularly where you're driving and you're power on, power off, power on, power off. And there will be other times where you really want to set the speed and pretty much stick at that. And actually, it's very tempting to sort of constantly move the throttle, but it might well be by actually settling it at a point. The boat actually just stays in contact with the water the whole time. It doesn't jump out. The prop can do its job. And to a certain extent, that's going to be a function of the wavelength as well. And I think actually we've got that as the next image in terms of what we might be able to do is to get the speed and get the power up. And that, oh, actually, sorry, it's a video now, isn't it? So let me stop there and come back to the video. So if I give you some background on this, this was a training exercise with an Atlantic lifeboat out of RYA. You can see it's quite windy on this occasion, and the boat's just going around doing its thing. And there are two key teaching points I use this video. Again, you can search on YouTube for this, so it's freely available. The boat's coming down and it's going to turn in a moment. You can see there it's coming downwind and the bow so went down into that wave, but the buoyancy of the tubes held it up. It's coming around to turn. And it's now going to start to head upwind. And you can see it hits a wave in a moment, and it's building up its momentum. Some nice seas to be playing around in there by the looks of it. And you can see the boat coming down, quite an impact there. You can see much more vertical there. And now the little caption that's come up is saying both engines are dead. So the helm has actually lost both engines. And now you can actually see a crewman moving around. And the learning point from here is what you're about to see used is a really valuable piece of kit if you're into advanced boating. One of the things we carry on our ribs are sea anchors or drogues. The RLI boats or all lifeboats are set up with easily deployable sea anchors. And why do we do that? Well, because the boat naturally wants to sit beam on to those weather conditions. We've said beam on is dangerous. So the sea anchor's out, and you'll see a breaking wave coming through and see it grab the boat, and it's a really sticky situation, but now see it come around head to wind. And that boat comes around head to wind because the sea anchor's done its job. So it's doing two things. It's holding the boat head to wind and it's buying time because it's going to arrest that drift downwind, and that's going to allow the crew on that boat to actually do what they need to, maybe to get it restarted, but it's particularly not going to leave them beam on to breaking waves. So great example there of A, how you can lose your engines, and B, then the benefits of a sea anchor.
It's a great bit of footage, that, isn't it? So where would they find that if they want to study that? Because it goes on for
I think if you look at YouTube and you just search RYA lifeboat, something like that, they will come up from that.
So we want to go through talking at sort of higher speeds now. How is that different from your sort of low speed cruising to now you're getting a bit of a motor on, and this is going to change the dynamic a little bit, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember going out on touched on it a few weeks ago in a different context, going out on a boat with Paul Lemmer. And Paul Lemmer's got a huge amount of experience in fast boats, racing, driving. And I remember being out with him in rougher conditions, and I was doing quite a lot of throttle on, throttle off. And he goes, "Why the hell are you doing that? Let me drive for a moment." And it was actually really educational. And he got on and he actually was driving it slightly differently. And my training came from an RYA point of view, which really was based on R&I training, which was based on generally a certain type of sea conditions, and Paul coming from a more racing fraternity. And the reality is it's about taking bits from all of these environments. And that was about setting that speed. And that will depend on the wavelength. And we might be able to get a speed, and as we bring the next image up, we might be able to get a speed where we can actually effectively jump between those crests. Now, there's risk with that. And I wouldn't necessarily say this is something we should go out and do, but there will be skippers that need to do it. You know, if your job is to get from A to B quickly and to do a job, then that might be a risk you decide to take. The price you might pay is if that wavelength opens up a bit and it doesn't, that momentum doesn't carry you from one crest to another, then basically the bow's dropping into the wave it's about to face, and there's potentially some very hard impacts to come. So there's, you know, you sort of pays your money and takes your choice in that respect. But it could be that with that wavelength, we find a certain speed which just allows us to contour those waves. It just means we just stay in contact, and it will be about fine adjustment, and we might be able to get an extra couple of knots out of it simply by backing off. And rather than the props coming out and constantly taking impacts, we just manage to make for a smoother ride.
I think, yeah, you can sometimes get the hull working a lot better, and you can be stuck, say, 25 knots or whatever, taking a hammering. And actually, if you just get up on top a little bit and get the hull working a little bit more, get the boat balanced a bit better and skipping across the top, there is those dangers that you said, but sometimes you can actually end up in a lot more comfortable situation, even though you're going faster, which sometimes to the uninitiated may not make sense.
Absolutely right. And the image behind me with the rib, we were training on those, and there was initially a sort of a strategy from the helms, which was there was only one throttle setting, which was fully down, and it was pretty rough. And we were getting battered, senseless. So we actually looked at, okay, so can we make better progress by backing off probably to 60, 75% speed of what we were trying to do? And actually we ended up going faster, because if you keep hitting waves, inevitably you're slowing down. So you go fast, you slow, you speed up, you slow. And actually you make far better progress sometimes if you actually just back off to maybe 60, 70% of that power. And then actually you're not taking those impacts which are not slowing you down. And actually, you're not damaging the skippers and the crew. And far too many skippers, fast boat skippers, end up with serious back and knee and ankle type issues. And if they can be avoided, that's got to be good.
So I'm going to show another slide here. This comes into wind and trim, etc. You've got some tabs there that are highlighted. What are we seeing in this picture?
Yeah, it was, I don't know where to actually put this in, but this is a really interesting area. And to pose a question to those listening. So let's imagine I'm sort of driving my boat straight towards you in front of me in the screen. And let's say the wind is coming in on this port bow. So it's coming in on that port bow. And the question for everybody is, when that wind's on that port bow, which way is the boat going to lean? Is it going to lean away from the wind, or is it going to lean into the wind? And logically enough, people would say, well, it's going to lean, it's going to be pushed to lean away from the wind. Now we're trying to go from A to B straight ahead. So we're trying to maintain that course, and we've got this wind on the port bow. And what you will find is that the boat will lean into the wind as you seek to maintain that heading. So the question that begs is why? And for a long time, I didn't understand it. And I went down to, I think it was the Wolfson Institute at University of Southampton to chat to chap's name, Barry Deakin, I think it was, who's hugely knowledgeable on this sort of thing. And he just like switched a light on of knowledge, which I thought was just brilliant. And he said, well, okay, so you're maintaining that heading and you've got the wind here. What does the wind want to do? What does the boat want to do? Well, the boat only wants to lie. Its only happy position is 90 degrees to the wind. That's where it wants to go. But you're trying to maintain that heading. So what do? Well, you dial in port helm to maintain that heading. Well, if you're on a port turn, what does the boat do? It leans over. So depending on where the wind is hitting the boat, it's feasible that you end up dialing in helm to achieve the course you wanted to go on. So why is that important? Well, we can settle that down by playing with our trim tabs, and that's what this image shows. But there's a real potential danger with it, because there is a danger that says that we're making progress in that direction and we've settled the boat down, but we're now potentially with full port lock to maintain our heading because of the way the wind's pushing about. And if the wind's coming this way and we've got breaking waves coming in from this side, then potentially we need to steer up to deal with some of those waves. But potentially we've got no port helm left because we've dialed it all in to maintain the heading because of that wind push. And it's just something to be aware of. It means we've got loads of starboard helm left, and we might be able to duck away to starboard. But it might impact the direction we need to go, because we might say, like we said, we need reserves of power. Arguably, we need reserves of steering as well. So it may well be we need to come around slightly more to turn it into a beam C so that we've got that ability to get out of trouble. And you see it particularly in big ribs where they've got light bows, or four-berth family motor cruisers with very light bows. They're very susceptible to pushing around very quickly to that beam on position. And it's something, take it out there, put your boat at different angles to the wind, and you'll see what I mean. And it seems counterintuitive, but that's what it does.
It's also, even in lighter conditions, certainly on a beam C, a more performance-orientated hull, a narrower craft, yeah, it will sit on one side, and just by a little bit of tap down, you can just level it out, and it just makes it more comfortable as well, because then the V is landing in the correct place, rather than it all riding up on the side of the boat as well. It becomes a drier, more comfortable ride.
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. You dial in the trim tabs, and you settle that boat down. And I think it's then thinking, what is the price I'm paying, perhaps, for needing to tab down to actually do that? Because the price you might be paying is that you're spending some of your port helm in that situation. It's not necessarily a problem, but it's actually by knowing that you're doing it and the price you're paying actually might make you make a different decision in a different set of conditions, where you realise there's quite a bit of risk coming in from your port side and you don't have any port helm left.
So for people that are wanting to hone their skills a little bit in these conditions, what's your advice for people to take this practical knowledge and to then go and experience it firsthand?
It is difficult, actually, because I think if we go back in time, we all used to push the boundaries a lot more than we do today, and that's health and safety. You know, we used to go out and do some serious rough water training, and then, you know, nowadays the risks inherent in all of that, and just make it very difficult for schools to actually do that. And I think it's building up slowly. It's going out, like we've said, in company, going on passage with people who are more comfortable in challenging conditions, going riding with them, you know, go and be their crew, go and sit at the back of the boat and watch them do it in a totally safe environment. And don't push the boundaries too much. You know, go out there when it's, you know, Poole Harbour's a classic. It can be really windy and you get really wet, but the waves are never actually really that big. But it doesn't mean that you don't experience head C, following C, beam C, and how you actually drive them. And those skills then play into going out into further away from land and so on and so forth. So I think it's build up slowly, always have backup, appreciate your limitations and that of your boat and your crew, and if in doubt, back off. Don't go if you're unsure.
And would you say, yeah, I mean, seat time is key to that, isn't it? Learning and saying, oh, okay, right, that's how the boat reacts to that, etc. But would you say also for a new boater, you might not want to just go and jump straight into a long, narrow performance stepped hull, big powered craft? I've even seen people that, you know, their first boat is a 10 metre or 9 metre rib with twin 300s on the back and things like that. As much as all of those boats are fantastic, would you say with everything, it's about just building up that experience level? Because certainly with more power, with 600 horsepower or, you know, twin 400s now, and, you know, bigger boats, things can go wrong a lot quicker and these waves can catch you out. And, you know, I've been on boats which are doing 60, 70 miles an hour and they feel like a smaller boat doing 40 miles an hour, just because everything is just dialed in and feels nice. But at the same time, an inexperienced skipper could be going along at 60 knots and then all of a sudden, wham, and their kids and stuff are injured.
Absolutely, and you know, you sum it up perfectly. And I think it you know, it's one of the great things that we can go out and buy, you know, 10 metre boats with twin 300s. The flip side of that is it comes with a cost, and and if we do 60, 70 knots in one of those boats, I think it's easy to think, oh, well, that's the same as in a car, but it's not. And there's no exact comparison in terms of boat speed versus a vehicle speed, but we're on a bumpy road and we're getting pushed around that road by the wind and the tide and so on. It's not the same as in a vehicle. And there's a lot more battering going on in terms of your body. And if things fail, they can fail catastrophically at that sort of speed. And that speed of 60, 70 knots could be comparable with, over 100 in a car. And fast boat driving is a different skill. We go out and do some stuff where we're doing very fast boat driving, and things just come up at you very, very quickly. And when you take an impact, it's really quite a serious impact. And you're pulling potentially massive amounts of G-force through your body. I remember seeing something a few years ago where in a rib doing something like 20 knots in a force 4 to 5, you might be pulling 4 to 5 G, only for small amounts of time, but big impacts coming. So yes, take your time, and if you do have one of those great, fast, very sexy looking boats, think about some specialist training from people who have the ability to teach you that, because that's not the domain necessarily of a Powerboat Level 2 instructor.
Yeah, and I think there are people out there, which if people want to call you guys at Powerboat Training UK, you can either instruct them on the best course that you offer, but you also are so well connected that you'll know people. I know there's people like Neil Holmes, Paul Sinclair. Paul Sinclair won Cowes Torquay with Steve Curtis and Richard Carr a few years ago. Him and his son James Sinclair are both RYA instructors in Poole, similar just down the road from you, and they do a course that is specific to very high performance boats. And
I think it's important to say that falls outside the RYA schemes, insofar as what you might do is, if you get a boat like that, do Powerboat Level 2, and that's Powerboat Level 2, and you're taught the skills up to maybe 20 knots, 25 knots. If you want to learn to go faster, that drops out of the RYA world, and that's really going to be bespoke, tailored training from a specialist in that sector.
It comes with its own disclaimers.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure the RYA would be keen for me to throw that disclaimer.
Yeah, well, obviously we want everybody to be boating safely, whatever conditions they are. And if they, like you say, if they're in doubt and they think it's a bit iffy, then stay at the bar in the marina or enjoy your boat and just stay locally. You don't have to. There's nobody forcing you to push boundaries, is there?
No, and I think you've mentioned it. Sorry about that. You've mentioned it a couple of times. YouTube, YouTube now, what an amazing resource. And I suppose one of the things with the internet and forums is, for everyone that speaks very lucidly and sensibly, there's one or two people that don't. But YouTube and just seeing and watching stuff is a really great resource, and it's a great way to get through the winter as well. And there's, we talked about Frank Kalowski at Safe Haven Marine in his videos. What an awesome resource to go and look and see how a really good boat actually handles rougher conditions.
Yeah, you can see like that Hull Over Inlet and loads of other YouTube videos. You can just study how boats behave. You can genuinely see where a skipper is really messed up. There was a video that I saw on Facebook the other day of a narrow entry entrance into a port, and it was a skippered rib on like a 10-seat charter rib type thing, and he dropped in from on a following sea, dropped the nose in, and then backed off, and that stern wave caught up with him, tipped it over and rolled the rib over, and he had 10 charter guests all in the water. Really poor skippering, but you can use these things and analyze and say, oh, okay, I understand how that boat is behaving and why it's done that.
Absolutely. And yeah, definitely get out there and watch those sort of things.
Cool. Well, over the last few weeks, we've gone through safety elements and the right kit to have on board, looked at the right type of boat to make sure that it's seaworthy. We've said, and we reiterated again tonight, if you're in doubt or you want to increase your knowledge, then to jump on with a buddy, join a Facebook group, for example, and go out in pairs or in groups. There are ones that go around the Isle of Wight, for example, in summer and things. I know we've been limited with COVID, but it gives you an idea to be able to do these things safely. And if you do have a bit of a mishap and you stuff the nose, etc., everybody else can laugh at you, and you can do things in a bit more of a camaraderie, but in a safe way where everybody's setting their own gentle pace and you step it up gradually. But Paul, thank you so much again for this evening. It's been really invaluable and really useful to look at these slides and just hone our skills, and for the new boater, hopefully get some pointers so that they feel a bit safer at sea.
A pleasure. Thanks, Tom.
So if you haven't already, we have our free digital subscription of Powerboat and RIB magazine. It's on powerboatandrib.com. You can register there for your free digital subscription, which not only covers the back catalogue, but also the future publications. It has Paul's column within the magazine there, and we're embedding these videos into the articles. So as opposed to the print publication, the digital version has embedded videos, so it's a lot more dimensional and a lot more immersive, but it's a good reference guide to be able to catch back up onto these. Likewise, on our YouTube channel, just search Powerboat and RIB or PBRTV. It will come up with the catalogue of these 9 episodes so far, so you should be able to come from a brand new boater that's never been on the water to right now being able to understand wave theory and how to throttle and trim your boat accordingly, depending on the wave conditions. So over the next couple of weeks, we've got live streams with Conrad of Exshore, a phenomenal battery-powered EV boat, the Elon Musk of the marine world, from Sweden. So we're going to be jumping on live and talking all about sustainability. We also have live streams prepared with Honda Marine, looking at the whole Honda catalogue, but also including the brand partnerships with Highfield, with Honwave, and with our other brands included in that. We also have more tuition with Paul, and a lot more in store as well. We're teaming up with Simrad, with Mercury Marine, 2 brands that I've been very close to in my racing career, and we're going to be working with Paul as well on creating some further really superb content with a boat manufacturer, which will all come about soon. So stay tuned for the content over the next month or so, because to keep boating alive, we really want to spearhead this digital side of Powerboat and RIB. So Paul, thank you again so much for your time this evening. Thank you to everybody watching. We've had people from all over the UK, but also across Europe, and a couple from Canada and also Dubai. So yeah, a real cross section of people. So thank you everybody, and good night.